As we continue on in our spring management course today, students, we want to talk about swarm preparations. Now, swarming is a challenge. And let me say right off the bat that I don't believe that there is any 100% totally for sure way to prevent swarming. I mean, it's just going to happen. And there are some things that we can do to get ahead of swarming. We can do our best oftentimes to manage it to the point where it doesn't happen, but you really have to stay after that. So don't think that there's an easy magical wand that we can wave over this swarm issue and never have a swarm. And because there really are several types of swarms that the honeybee colony will perform. The most often swarm that is hard to manage is a reproductive swarm. And that simply means that honeybees actually produce another colony from your colony. And this happens in the spring of the year, and if it did not happen, then we would have a rapid decline in honeybees. So this is reproduction. This is one colony in your yard making another colony, reproductive swarm. They will do it almost no matter what. So in that case, some of the techniques that we use to prevent swarming doesn't work because we oftentimes will say, well, just give them more room. Well, if they want to reproduce, they can do it with a lot of room in the box. So that's the challenging one. There's the other swarm problem of a hive being congested, really full of bees. All the comb is full of honey and nectar and brood, and there's just no room for the queen to lay. And that's a congested hive. And when they get congested like that, they realize, wow, we're so full that we need to kind of split up and make another colony. And that way we've got enough resources to pull this off. And so they produce a swarm, another colony, from a very congested colony. And you may have noticed I'm not using the word crowded. I hear that word used a lot to describe a colony that swarms. Oh, if they get really crowded, then they're going to swarm. I don't like that word because bees love to be crowded. That's a colony. They're a single organism. And we want our bees to be really crowded so they can fight off small hive beetle and control pests and diseases. We want crowded colonies. But what we don't want is a congestion where there's simply no place for those bees to put in resources or for the queen to lay. And that's what I call congested. Now, another misconception about swarming is that everything is going great and all at once today, 15 minutes ago, the bees got an idea, hey, let's swarm. Well, that doesn't happen either. Swarm takes a lot of preparation. A bee colony doesn't decide on a whim to swarm. And it's not something that just randomly happens because it does take a lot of preparation in advance. So preparation for a swarm by that colony of yours takes a lot of time. Now, honeybees are predanderous. And what that means is that they produce their drones in the spring before they produce new queens. And usually they produce these drones about 4 weeks before they start raising queens. The reason that is because they want to have the chance for your drones, well, technically it wouldn't be your drones from your hive, but let's say they want drones to be mature enough to mate with virgin queens. So they start raising the drones ahead of time before they start raising their queens. And this is important because you want those mature drones in the air in the drone congregation areas, because it means that they want to fill those drone congregation areas up with these mature drones that are ready to mate with those virgin queens when they take their mating flight. So it does take preparation. Well, let's talk about this whole thing about swarm preparations. As you can see, let's talk about first the queen. Now, the queen initiates swarming. And she does this by pheromone control, by evaluating the pheromones that she's giving off and the level of pheromones that are coming back to her, so she can easily determine if the hive is congested. Now, in order to initiate this swarm, she has to be put on a diet. She has to lose weight. She's so heavy, her ovarioles are so full of eggs, she lays up to 1,000, possibly 3,000 eggs a day. So she has to be placed on a diet, and this diet is important because she's going to have to fly with this swarm. And so if she's too heavy, she can't pull off this flying. And her diet does have to contain royal jelly, but they just cut it back quite a bit. Now, if she doesn't get cut back on the amount of royal jelly she's consuming, she won't be slim enough, light enough to fly. But they still have to feed her because, remember, they're cutting back her diet so she can fly, but they have to feed her enough so she can still lay some eggs, because she's got to lay eggs in the queen cups that they've made, these swarm cells that they've made, these swarm cell cups. She's got to lay eggs in there. So they do have to usually keep feeding her somewhat sufficiently for her to keep laying eggs. Well, in your colony, usually there are more than one swarm cups. I want you to remember they're a cup. You've seen these before. Just let me show you an image here of a queen cup. And you can see how this cup is called a cup, because if you turn it upside down, then you could drink coffee out of it. It looks like a little teacup, right? Well, they're only called cells once they're capped over. So that's going to make you a very bright student. Thank you again for letting me teach you these neat things. I want you to have the proper terminology. So once that queen cup is filled with royal jelly, and then the larva's developing, right before the larva pupates on about days 6, 7, 8, they will cap that cup off, and it will be called a queen cell. Those of you that have never experienced swarm or spring management, I know that for you this is going to really be new things. And remember, you can always pause this video when I'm talking, write things down. So the neat thing about this, taking an online class like this, is if I was teaching you live and you want to ask a question and you have to wait a few minutes, you may forget what I said. This way you can go back. Okay, so these queen cups are made along the bottom of frames, and that's critical. See, when queens die, like an emergency situation, like you accidentally kill your queen and they have to raise an emergency queen, or if a queen becomes not so good anymore, she's starting to not lay well, then they begin to, either in an emergency situation where you've killed her, or they need to replace her. That's called supersedure. They're superseding their old queen that's failing. Those cells, those cups, are usually formed on the top half of your brood frames. And usually supersedure or emergency replacement cell cups are only 1 or 2, 3 or 4 at the most. But in light of what we're talking about in swarm preparation, the swarm cells are huge in number. You're going to have 12 to 25 all over the bottom of those frames, as you can see in this image here. And so it's important to realize that one of the key factors in swarm preparation or swarm management on your part is to keep an eye on the bottom half of all your brood nest area frames. That's where you're going to first get the indication that something's going on, because you can catch them in the act of swarm preparation by developing these queen cups. So keep an eye on that. They can also build queen cups over parts of the comb that is damaged or built out irregularly, and so it may not always be at the very bottom. So something I want to tell you about beekeeping is everything we say about bees, there's always an exception. I mean, there's no hard, fast rule every single time. Can you have a swarm cell higher up on the comb? Of course you can. If that comb is irregular, it's convenient for them to do it on the top half, it's possible. But if the comb is not irregular, if it's smooth and a normal looking frame of a comb, then they're going to build it on the lower half. Just keep that in mind. We have to remember that they're building out these swarm cells, and we can observe them because it takes 16 days from the time the egg is laid in that cell until the queen emerges. So this is done over several weeks or several days, and it's done over a couple of weeks of time, almost a little over 2 weeks. So you have an advance notice, a warning sign that your swarm is about, your colony is about to swarm. So these empty queen cups, as you can see here in the image, themselves may not be a sign that your hive is swarming, because in my hives I always see these kind of cups along the bottom of the frame. In other words, the hive, most colonies, not all, but most colonies have these cups at the side of the frame or the bottom half of the frame, just in case. So these are there. They're always in your colony. You're going to find them. So how do you find out if you need to think about swarm preparation or not? Well, take your flashlight and shine it into these cells. You'll have to hold your frame at an angle so you can see down in there really well. And what you're looking for, class, is you're looking for a larva that's at the bottom of that cup in royal jelly. So in other words, if they are just a standby cup in case we need them, it's a queen cup, it's on the bottom of my frame, oh my gosh, do I have a swarm or not? Take your flashlight, shine it in the cup. It's either going to be bone dry, nothing in it, that means there's no swarm going on, or you're going to see a larva in there and it's swimming in a pool of royal jelly, and you look in the other cups, you'll see the same thing. Then you know, uh-oh, it's full, they're preparing to swarm. Now they will not swarm until this cell cup is drawn out and the queen pupates and they cap off the bottom of that cell cup, and now it's called a cell, a queen cell. Now they can swarm any time after that cup is capped over, but that virgin queen is not going to emerge for 8 days. But as soon as it's capped over, something could happen. So you need to get ahead of the game and make sure that you don't let that get capped over. In other words, we'll give you some tips on what to do, but in other words, you know you've got a little time if you just see that larva just starting out. You've got 8 days if you just see a 1-day-old larva, for example. So these empty queen cups are not always a sign that your hive is getting ready to swarm. As I said earlier, the queen has to lose some weight. She has to be about 1/3 of her previous body weight in order for her to be light enough to swarm. And workers are feeding her less, or maybe she accepts less food from them. We're not sure scientifically, but definitely she does not eat as much. And then workers, as we get closer to the swarm event, workers begin to treat her roughly. They're kind of agitated or more picky with her, and then the egg production starts to slow dramatically. And you'll notice less open brood to care for. This is another sign. And I take it that many of you taking this online class are experienced beekeepers. Maybe you've already had the beginner's course that I teach, and or you've kept bees for a while. But if you have to develop an eye to see the level of brood that you have. And when you start to notice all at once you have a smaller amount of brood that you're looking at it going, wow, what's happening? My queen's not laying as much as she was. Possibly a sign that they're not feeding her as much, therefore she can't lay as much, and they might be preparing to swarm. So that's another sign that your colony may be ready to start this swarming process. Also, this means that since there's less brood to care for, this creates many young bees that normally would be caring for brood. Nurse bees is what we call them. Now they don't have to feed so many larvae anymore, and they're just kind of hanging out. there's a greater nutritional reserve in the colony. Since those nurse bees aren't feeding the larvae as much as they were, there's not as much larvae, then they're not consuming as much protein or carbohydrates to produce royal jelly to feed them or to make worker jelly past day 3. So in this case, you may see that there's an accumulation, a buildup during this 2-week, 3-week swarm preparation. There's a buildup of pollen, nectar, and honey in your colony. Since there's more resources in the colony, this means that workers gain weight because they're not so stressed on having to feed everybody this food. They can leisurely just hang out and eat more and not have to basically not work as hard, and so they do gain some weight. Now, when they get closer, about probably 10 days prior to a swarm, about a week, week and a half, the worker bees actually begin gorging themselves on food. And the reason they do this, what is that colony going to have to do once they swarm and land and make a new nest area? They're going to have to build a lot of what? Comb. They've got to produce a lot of wax. And the bee has to consume about 11 pounds of nectar to produce 1 pound of wax from their wax glands. So these young bees, these nurse bees, are actually gorging themselves 10 days prior to swarm so that they can be ready to produce a lot of wax to build comb. And so you might notice that as well. There's less foraging because these bees are gorging themselves on all the honey that's in this hive. So they fill their honey crop, their honey take, to sustain the swarm building that's coming up in the future. They do that several days before they swarm. It activates, or in some cases reactivates, their wax glands. So as a swarming day approaches, scout bees begin to leave this parent hive, your original colony, and they begin to explore and investigate a new nesting place. So this is several days before the colony swarms. Scout bees are traveling around, anywhere from close by to far away. They're looking for a nice spot in a tree where the middle has rotted out. There's a big hole in the tree. They're looking for a place in a soffit of a home where a little bit of caulk fell off. They're looking for anything, an abandoned barn, an abandoned car. They're looking for a place about the size that they want to move their colony to. These scout bees are taking an inventory of what's available in real estate. And so these scout bees are hard at work. Now, before the emergence of the virgin queen, remember I said she's developing in these queen cups, and then on about day 8, these queen cups are capped over and they're called a queen cell. Probably about the time they're ready to be capped over or just before they're capped over, this is when the swarm begins to leave. And most of the time we feel like they're not going to leave until they're capped over. I have seen them leave as late as the virgin queens emerging and then swarming the next day. So again, not hard, definite science or rules about the timing, but pretty close to when they're capped over or just before or just after. Okay, so this is when they begin to swarm. Bees become quiet in the hive just before they swarm because foraging is greatly reduced. Nobody's going out to forage today because we're going to swarm, right? And so they're kind of quiet, getting ready to consider swarming. Now, there is what's called breaking. This is a dance signal that tells the bees that we're about to depart. They do this breaking, this dance type movement for about 10 or 15 minutes prior to a swarm. And remember, a swarm, if you don't know this, I realize some of you may be brand new, so I'm trying to remember everything about my students, that you may be just taking this class with very limited knowledge, or you may be very experienced and this might be a real good brush-up course. But a swarm is when about half of the colony leaves with the old queen and the other half stays behind. So in this case, half of the colony is preparing to swarm And we'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about which half and how they decide that. But they do this about 10 or 15 minutes before they swarm. They start doing a dance. It's called zigzag running among the bees. It's something that it's hard to observe unless you happen to be there during these few minutes prior to the swarm. But it is neat to see if you're so fortunate to time it just right. But of course, if that's the case, you haven't done your part in preventing a swarm, because you had a 2-week notice that they were going to do it through the signs that I just mentioned, and you did nothing. So you don't want to observe this. But sometimes it happens. We all have, life happens to us. We get busy. We take a trip to Europe. I don't know. We just can't manage our hives always the way we want to. That's just the reality. And it's important not to beat yourself up over that. It's okay that you just have to accept the fact that your time is limited and you're keeping bees to the best that your time allows. And sometimes we just can't manage our colonies the way we want to. Swarms happen. So as this swarm begins to get ready to leave, they create this whirling sound with their wings, and it starts being imitated by more bees and more bees. It's a ramp up, all engines running, kind of the flight deck. All the planes are warming up their engines, so you have this whirling sound in the colony. And the queen doesn't really fit into the equation of bossing people around. Like, okay, let's go, I'm the queen, we're all gonna swarm, let's all line up and get ready to shove off. No, not gonna happen that way at all. In fact, the opposite. The queen is not that willing to leave the colony. It's her hive, she's there, she's doing a job, right? She's the mother. But the queen is pushed toward the entrance by other bees to kind of get her going. There's piping sounds that are made, meep, 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 meep. You hear that in the colony as they're pushing the queen forward to the door. And there's really no apparent reason to determine which bees go and which bees stay. We try to evaluate that over time. Entomologists have tried to consider what is the reason that some stay and some go. It's a coin toss. Nobody knows. But bees of all ages join in on the swarm. So, you know, we know that there are young bees, nurse bees, but bees of all ages actually join in the swarm that are between the ages of 4 to 23 days old. This research has been done. So the majority are 4 to 23 days old. Now the swarm, it actually contains about anywhere from 40 to 80% of the original colony. And so we usually just break it up and say half of them leave, half of them stay. The average is about 66% of the original colony will actually swarm. So maybe a little bit over half. But the average swarm has between 12,000 to 14,000 bees. Now that doesn't sound like a lot if your colony, you know, has 40,000 bees in it. But if you see a swarm, if you've ever had the opportunity, the privilege to see a swarm, beautiful. It's better than seeing a rainbow. It's better than seeing the gold at the end of the rainbow. This is awesome to see a swarm. It is so unbelievable. I mean, it's just a cloud of bees swirling around, and it's just breathtaking if the first time you see it. I was probably in my early 20s. I wasn't a beekeeper when I was standing in my front yard, and literally a swarm I was engulfed by a swarm. I was in the middle of it. Bees were bumping into me, but not stinging me. And it was just amazing. It's so loud and so much energy. Those bees are excited about making a new home. But it is cool to watch. It's depressing if you don't want your colony to swarm, right? If you want them to make a lot of honey, you need a lot of population. Half of them leave, your honey production's not going to be as good as it might be, and so that can be depressing. Swarms of about 2,500 to 40,000, though, have been reported. Now let me say here, since I said 40,000, there is a difference between swarming and absconding. Swarming is, like we're talking about half of the colony leaves to form a new colony. Absconding means all the bees leave the hive. They fly away with the old queen, nobody's left behind. That's different, and that can be depressing as well. Okay, so there has been a lot of experiments that have been done, like I said, by Tom Seeley, where swarms were actually captured and they were marked and they were rehived to allow them to swarm again kind of quickly. And the purpose of this was to see who does swarm. So they found that not necessarily do the same bees swarm that may have swarmed yesterday. The ones that were marked, they captured, they stayed behind. And so they also found that some drones join in the swarm. Maybe 50, more or less 50 drones will be found in that swarm. That's important too, because again, as I taught you in the basic beekeeping course, the drones are important not for the hive that they are from, because that colony, has a queen, and if they raise their own queen from a hive that has drones, she won't mate with those drones. Those are her brothers. So drones are important because in the spring, all colonies are raising drones for other colonies to mate with those drones. So they do take those along for genetic purposes, reproductive purposes. But unlike workers, drones are not gorging themselves on food before they leave, because drones are pretty much fed by the colony, and so they don't have to really gorge themselves. Also, bees from other hives may join the swarm. Now, I have seen this a lot when we have bees on citrus and they begin to swarm in a yard where there's orange trees all around, a lot of hives there. One hive swarms, and all at once another hive kind of like, what's going on? And they swarm as well. Maybe it's timing, maybe it was a coincidence that two hives swarmed at once. Well, regardless, it's often pretty common that these two swarms will converge together as one swarm, and maybe three. I've seen a whole orange tree completely engulfed with bees, practically from top to bottom. It is staggering to watch. My buddy tried to shake some bees from this orange tree that was just full from top to bottom of swarm. And I stood there and filmed them, and it was just amazing to watch. So sometimes the other hives do join in on it from nearby hives. Especially we've noticed if these hives are queenless, then these hives may say, hey, can we come along with you? We don't have a queen. You guys look like you have something going on, We're kind of like done without a queen. Can we just join you and party with you guys? It's crazy to see this. It really is. Small hive beetle, a pest that has come into our country and gets into our hives. We notice that these small hive beetles will fly right along with the swarm sometimes, so don't think that the beetles are going to be left behind. They can fly too. This isn't confirmed, but we've noticed that they show up with the swarm when they land. Well, let's talk about the swarm emergence. How does it happen? The swarm rushes out of the parent hive, just starts spitting bees out of the front in enormous numbers. If you see this, you're like, wow, look at that. Sometimes I have seen a heavy nectar flow when the bees start to leave the colony, and I'm starting to think, oh my, look how many bees are flying out of this hive. Is that a swarm? But then you look and you see bees coming back in, carrying pollen, and so you're thinking, okay, I don't think that's a swarm. A swarm is when they're just boiling out. I mean, there's no question that's a swarm. And when they're boiling out, they're leaving. This ends video 2. Please follow the next link to video 3 for a continuation of spring management.